Brexit.
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 Brexit. Brexit.
Do you remember that time when British politics was obsessed with Brexit as politicians were negotiating the UK's departure from the European Union? We were so obsessed, we even did a podcast about it called Brexitcast, which eventually became this podcast, Newscast, which has been celebrating its 5th birthday as a daily podcast this week. And we thought we'd go right back to where it started and get the gang together again for a special look back at Brexit. And also a bit of a look forward, because it is popping up again in British politics. So we did that in the BBC Radio Theatre at the BBC HQ in London as we were celebrating the 5th birthday of this podcast, Newscast. Hello, this is a special episode of the Newscast podcast because we're celebrating the fact that we've been making episodes every day, which are available on BBC Sounds, for 5 years. I think this makes it our... Oh, thank you. Which I think makes it our wooden anniversary. Wooden. So we're marking that momentous moment in the medium of podcasting by doing a big show in front of a live audience made up of lots of the people who listen to our podcast. And we thought we would put it on TV as well. And we thought we'd go right back to where we actually started our podcasting journey, me and Chris, and then Laura joined a few weeks afterwards, where we started a little podcast called Brexitcast. And we covered loads of Brexit news in lots of detail. Lots of people joined us along the way. And we're joined now by Faisal Islam, the BBC economics editor, who's one of the people that joined us too. And Chris and Laura, the OGs, are here in the BBC Radio Theatre. Hello, everyone. Now, we don't want to get too self-indulgent, do we?
What, on this podcast?
Or do we? Laura, do you want to cast your mind back to... I think the first episode that we ever did of this podcast was June 2017. It was the first day of the negotiations. Mm-hmm. David Davis turned up in Brussels with no paperwork.
Yeah.
A guy called Michel Barnier had a huge binder,
yeah,
groaning with paperwork.
Yeah.
Just remind us of the world we were in that day.
So Theresa May was Prime Minister. She was trying to, more than anything else, I think, hold her party together, which had been torn asunder by the very activity of a referendum where they'd been allowed to campaign on both sides. And that ripped the plaster off what had been a wound in the Tory party for many, 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 many years. And she was all the time trying to keep the show on the road. Well, in her cabinet, there were people who were determined to do in the other side. There were already at that stage people who were quite determined to do her in. And at the same time, because she was so nervous about having another big, massive political Barney, she was completely paranoid about even showing the tiniest bit of ankle about the eventual kind of Brexit deal that she would find A, acceptable to her and the cabinet she'd put together, and B, that she thought might get through Parliament. Mm. And it was, looking back now, she was kind of always on a hiding to nothing, even though now it's interesting, lots of people go, oh, I wish I'd backed Theresa May's deal, because actually that looks like not that bad. And people who were on the Remain side, many of them have regrets about that. So into that, of course, David Davis was a sort of like to think of himself as a swashbuckling Brexiteer who was charged with the job of getting it done before getting it done was invented as a three-word slogan instead of just a normal sentence. And yeah, that's where we were, really. She was just about trying to keep the show on the road.
And Chris, do you remember when you were doing BBC Breakfast and you were stood on College Green outside Parliament and you did your now infamous soundbite about asking Mr. Blobby what was going on?
To be quite honest, looking at things right now, I haven't got the foggiest idea what is going to happen in the coming weeks. Is the Prime Minister going to get a deal with the EU? Don't know. Is she going to be able to get it through the Commons? Don't know about that either. I think you might as well get Mr. Blobby back on to offer his analysis, because frankly, I suspect his is now as good as mine.
Oh, Chris Mason, don't do yourself down.
Can you remember what was actually going on that day?
Well, there was a trail featuring Mr. Blobby that went out on BBC One at 7:01 as I was putting my earpiece in on College Green, which is why this inflatable pink character from the 1990s was uppermost in my mind before dawn had even broken. He's not perpetually there, but he was because he'd just been mentioned. And the thing is, I'd had a thought rattling around in my head for a few weeks. I hadn't decided I was going to do that morning. It just came to me in and of the moment. But I had been thinking about the broader point, which is that we, obviously as journalists, you're constantly trying to find things out, work out what people are thinking and saying and where things might move and where the balance of opinion is, etc., etc. Everyone could tell you what they wanted. Everyone could offer a view about where things might go. But there was a remarkable amount that was unknowable. And so I'd become frustrated with my own reporting and indeed just observing more widely the kind of conversation where you could be asked a question on the air as a reporter and give a perfectly plausible, thought-through and well-sourced answer, but it might well be absolutely useless to the audience because that was a combination of the whims and perspectives and outlooks on that day, which were then overtaken by something out of the ordinary 2 minutes, 2 hours, 2 days, or 2 weeks later. And that kept happening, didn't it?
It kept happening all the time. And I think I also remember a funny conversation that went on over a period of months with one of my big bosses at the time, who's now departed from this building, not in bad circumstances, I said that in a very mysterious way. But every now and again he would phone me and say, I really need you to go and find the Brexit plan. It's like, the thing is, there isn't one.
No,
like,
exactly.
I've been trying, I promise you, I'm asking every cabinet minister, every junior minister, every PPS, every special advisor, everybody, Larry the cat, everybody else. It doesn't exist. And then he went, oh, yes, but it must be somewhere. And I was like, I've got to tell you, it doesn't. That's why, for us, I think, going back then, there was this need, I think, for what we were trying to do, what you guys had the idea of doing, is trying to explain what was going on, because there was nothing like the usual kind of certainty where you have a government and you have an opposition. They have a plan and a manifesto, and of course they get buffeted around by events, but broadly speaking, everybody kind of knows where this is going. And that's just not the situation, for ill or for good, whichever, however you want to see it. I'm sure we have strong views in the audience tonight. That's just not the situation we were in. It was absolutely uncharted for everybody. And, you know, now, all these years later, you've got a leader of the opposition, you know, struggling to catch a break, and one of her big messages is, it was terrible, we didn't have a plan. And, you know, we were trying to report on, you know, give an answer when there isn't an answer. It's a weird thing.
Faisal, if you look at kind of history as a series of branches, do you think there was one bit where like...
Very Cummings-esque, that? Very Cummings-esque.
Oh, no, it was David Davis who liked the trees and the branches, didn't he?
Rip off a mask at this point.
Yeah, no, what was for you, was there a sliding doors moment where it all could have gone completely differently? Or actually, was it just one sliding door after another, after another, after another?
I have been keeping uncharacteristically quiet here because, of course, I wasn't part of the gang at this point because I was working for a different broadcaster.
That's okay.
Apparently, they do exist. But it was, I mean, I think so many, as you guys captured so well at the time, when in the first couple of years of Brexitcast, and beyond as well, which was just how arcane some of the details were, but they became things that people were going to fight battles to the death over. Like, I sometimes have sort of flashbacks to thinking, did I run to a live point to talk about the Malthouse Compromise?
Yeah.
Did I?
Common external tariff.
And then the classic one was, this must have been early 2018. This is sounding like some sort of like NAM story, isn't it? And it was like, literally, there was a week's battle over the difference between the customs union and our customs union.
Yeah, I remember that.
In fact, we might get that one back again.
Oh, yeah, no, the Lib Dems
might
have
get that one
started
back
that.
again, exactly.
Laura, the thing that has kept ringing in my ears this week as I started thinking about us doing this episode was that documentary you did, one of many award-winning documentaries you did about this period, where Julian Smith, who was the chief whip for the Conservatives for a lot of that time, said to you in his office, and it was around the day that Brexit actually happened, I think, he said, do you know what, right at the beginning, when it was clear we'd done really badly in the election, we should have just reached out to Labour and done a deal that we knew would get through Parliament. And you just think, wow, if they had done that, how differently that whole period would be, if they'd started with that rather than ending with that and doing it badly.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to what we were saying at the beginning, is Theresa May saw her primary objective was to try and keep the party together. So that's the approach that she took. And it might, you know, the idea of, oh, well, could you have had some kind of cross-party commission? Could you have had some kind of different way of doing it? I mean, I think that's probably all la-la land, right? Because Jeremy Corbyn was the leader of the Labour Party, who actually quietly has a lot of antipathy towards the EU, as we now know. You know, we now know more about that. But however, the focus on Tory party politics is obviously one of the things that made it so difficult for Theresa May to get anywhere with it. But if she'd had a majority and not been therefore had a sort of broken leadership, because that then meant everybody in her cabinet that fancied a tilt of the job was from that moment more interested in having a tilt of the job than trying to get anything constructively. But it is interesting now, there are, you know, people who were on different sides of the argument who say actually as a group, as a cohort, that Parliament could have gone for the May deal and it might have worked. But I don't, you know.
And the thing that I just have never quite been able to get my head around, and you think I would have been able to do it by now, is like, I can't tell you what the parallel universe would be like, where there's either a different Brexit deal or Brexit didn't happen at all. Like, actually, what would have happened with the EU-wide procurement of the COVID vaccine? People could make all sorts of theoretical arguments about, like, oh, the UK would have had to have been in it, and then the vaccine would have been slower to get to the UK. But equally, there was politics when we were in the EU. We didn't take part in everything when we were in the EU, so it's very difficult to present the alternative to then measure what we've got.
Yeah, and I suppose at least picking away at one of those hypotheticals, there's an interesting argument, isn't there, around imagine, where would the debate be in the UK had the referendum result been the equal but opposite? In other words, a decisive but still, not far off 50-50 split. I think the reality is the debate would have continued and there have still been very, very hearty arguments that the question of our relationship with our nearest neighbours should continue. What's been interesting, I think, and I think we're just emerging into a different phase, is that we had all of those years, didn't we, where we talked about, or politics, the sort of political class talked about nothing but Brexit. You think back to the 2019 election where, getting Brexit done was that central argument. And then you compare it with an election a short 5 years later where Brexit barely got a mention because so many people within politics, whatever their view about it, were just scorched by the experience, really. And various parties concluded it was not in their interest to talk about it. And just now, I think, you're beginning to get a little bit of a sense, and you're seeing how Prime Minister is treading around it carefully, but an attempt to bring the question of our relationship with our nearest neighbours back into, if you like, conventional political discussion alongside everything else, as opposed to either talking about nothing but, talking about it to the exclusion of pretty much everything else, or not talking about it at all.
And we will talk about that. I was just going to say just another ridiculous, fantasy bit of theorising. Is there a world where Boris Johnson still would have been Prime Minister in around about 2020, even if Brexit hadn't happened? Because Cameron said he wasn't going to carry on forever and ever and ever. So they would have had a Tory leadership contest. Yeah. George Osborne wasn't super popular, and he was the chosen successor by Cameron, and Boris Johnson would have won that.
It's quite likely that the leadership, in that fantasy world, it's quite likely that leadership race might have been Osborne v Johnson, and the Conservative membership would have been quite likely to go for Johnson. But, we just don't.
It's just a bit of fun.
We just don't.
Don't phone in. It's just for fun.
And there could have been all sorts of other events, and we've got no idea of telling. And remember also, if you actually look carefully at polling, Boris Johnson, by historical comparison, even though he got a massive majority, was not a kind of overwhelmingly popular prime minister or an overwhelmingly popular politician. What he was from the start was incredibly famous and well known, with that capability of pulling in attention and knowing how to make headlines and knowing how to attract sort of bees to a honeypot, right? That was his huge appeal as a politician. But there are plenty of people in the Tory party who from day dot thought he was not fit for the office. Plenty of people thought the opposite, but there are plenty of people knocking around who thought he wasn't up to it. But in the dire circumstances, because the thing I was going to say about Brexit, one of the reasons why lots of politicians don't want to talk about it, because during that whole period, right, our politics failed. It couldn't cope with it. It couldn't handle it. Our parliament couldn't find a resolution. So it went to what is the kind of, the Graham Norton red chair moment when you all get chucked over the back. You end up with the general election, right? Which, in a way, that is the ultimate way that our democracy works. When the politician and the political process fails, you end up with a general election. But Parliament, as a group, as a body of people who all believe very strongly they're there for the right reasons, they don't always necessarily end up that way, but that's why they're there in the first place. But it failed. They couldn't find an agreement. And that was a kind of dreadful experience for them. It was sort of a dreadful experience for the country, whatever side you were on. But for everybody here tonight, to hear us all wanging on day after day, but also for people on the news every night to see these images of people screaming at each other.
Yeah, that
on college
anger,
green,
yeah.
screaming, crying, upset, being inside Parliament. Me and Paddy were talking about this last weekend, being inside Parliament, people up in each other's faces of colleagues that they'd had for years, screaming, crying. Like, it was awful in lots of ways. So it's no surprise to me that people don't really want to talk about it. And I think you're right. I think we're at the beginning of an era where basically it will go back to being an important issue that bubbles up every now and again for people who care. They'll be really passionate about it. But sort of pre-referendum, that's where it was, isn't it? I mean, it popped up every now and again as a kind of flashpoint. But it was one of these issues. It was normally at the sort of near the bottom of the top 10. But for people who really cared, they really, really cared. But it was kind of niche. Is that fair?
But it could flip now, couldn't it?
Yeah.
You could
Yeah.
get the other side of the
Yeah.
debate deciding to, keep going at this. And I think one of the other failings, from my perspective, from an econ hat on, is that those arguments that could have been had about where exactly you land it, in the end, the ejector seat also applies to how we left.
Right.
It's a very clean, hard leaving. And, there may have been an argument that actually if you take all of the political arguments and you take all of the economic arguments and where everyone stands, you might have gone for something more in the middle, or at least something not off at one extreme. That debate is starting again now.
I went back to my old, it's called the Brit Pack. That's what we journalists in Brussels called ourselves because we were so lame, we came up with a nickname like that. And I went back to the old Brit Pack WhatsApp group, which all the people who are still there are still in. And I was looking at it this afternoon and I felt really sad because they were all talking about Nick Thomas-Symonds' visit to Brussels yesterday, and I wish I'd been there. So Nick Thomas-Symonds is the not very famous minister who works in the Cabinet Office, who's going to spearhead the actual technical negotiations over Keir Starmer's reset with the EU. Please help me. What did Nick Thomas-Symonds do?
Well, I think even his job title is an illustration of that, if you like, for want of a better phrase, normalisation of a conversation about our relationship with the EU as opposed to the either omerta or noise. Minister for European Union Relations. Because even that job title a few years ago would have come laden with all sorts of
Nobody would have wanted to do it.
Well, yeah, and instantly leapt on by people on both sides of the argument as to whether they sort of loved or hated that very idea. So he was out there yesterday giving a speech. I was out there the day before covering the Prime Minister's trip to both NATO, the Defence Alliance, the headquarters of NATO is in Brussels, and then this dinner that he went to, the first British Prime Minister to go to a dinner of European Union leaders. But what we're seeing from the Prime Minister, and it was fleshed out by Nick Thomas-Symonds, is this idea about how Labour is trying to tentatively make the case that the UK can have a closer relationship with the EU, as they would see it, a better relationship with the EU, but within the confines of what they call their red line. So not rejoining the customs union, not rejoining the single market, not having freedom of movement. So what can they get within those confines is an interesting discussion. Nick Thomas-Symonds making that argument, the Prime Minister doing the same. The EU is really keen on a youth mobility scheme, which has gone through a number of rebrands to try and make sure it doesn't sound like freedom of movement for a chunk of the population, because that would be politically kind of quite hard to sell in the UK. Why? Well, firstly, the EU is bigger than the UK. There'd probably be more people coming here than the other way round. Secondly, it just does look like freedom of movement to a group of people, and that is one of the red lines, so that's a bit tricky. It might also be a scheme that leans broadly in the direction of middle-class folk who might be more likely to take advantage of that kind of stuff. That also might be something that becomes a bit of a hard thing to sell.
Just on the more political side of the conversation, Laura, we got an opinion poll this week. And of course, an opinion poll is just a snapshot of public opinion at one point. It's not a prediction of any election results or anything, that put reform in pole position.
Yep.
So it's worked out pretty well for Nigel Farage this whole period, then, if that's the case.
It's worked out incredibly well for Nigel Farage at this stage. I think, they could achieve something absolutely enormous in the next few years. They could equally well implode. We just do not know. However, the idea that suddenly all would be well and the UK traditional big two parties would look like they could handle everything if only they got Brexit sorted out was for the birds. However, as Chris notes, I think that post us actually leaving, the sort of salience of Brexit as the issue has just completely crashed through the floor. And, I don't think Reform's success in the polls at the moment, and then eventually managed to get MPs in the Commons and the kind of strides that they hope to make, I think that's about things far beyond what happened with Brexit. I think the angst in this country from Brexit, which was partly that we had a government that was largely focused on that and on itself, which contributed to all sorts of government failures during that period, is of course part of what's led to reform success. But you can't draw a straight line from Brexit.
The extraordinary thing, I think, about reform and where they are at the moment is that Nigel Farage, up until the vehicle of reform, had been incredibly skilled at making the most politically out of an issue that he did a lot to increase the salience of. In other words, our relationship with the EU and arguing for Brexit. What they're managing to pull off now, which is far harder, history sort of suggests, in the political system we have, is to have a party with a far broader pitch and continue to, as they did with their breakthrough at the election, and then we've seen their rise in the opinion polls since, that they're consistently in the 20s now. Yes, in this YouGov poll the other day, within the margin of error, they were 1 point ahead of Labour, ahead of the Conservatives as well. And they are, Labour and the Conservatives are both spooked. They are both thinking, my goodness, because Nigel Farage is beginning to be able to make an argument, and who knows where this goes in the coming years, where he can say the electorate concluded the Conservatives failed, hence the big Labour majority, and if he can prosecute an argument that says, and Labour are failing too, and can say, woo, what might be the alternative if neither of those are going concerns, then, who knows?
And you can be sure as that, sorry, just quickly, you can be sure as damn it, if the government says, oh, let's go into PEM. Well, if you go into PEM, which is a customs arrangement, well, then the UK government would have to, in some ways, give up more of its right to have a say over things that British businesses have to do. Who's that a gift to? Nigel Farage. If they do a deal over a youth mobility pact, which as it stands, the proposal from the EU, I'm pretty sure doesn't have a cap on it. It would be saying an unlimited number of young people would be able to come and live and work in the UK. Who's that immediately going to give lots of political opportunity to? Nigel Farage. And that's the reason the government's so nervous about it. So I think, Brexit with a capital P, is absolutely gone from our debate in any way that we might recognise from our early days of Brexitcast. Does that mean that the issues and the vulnerabilities for the government have gone? No, absolutely not.
But you can also flip it, can't you? Because for Labour, the mirror image of what you guys did during Brexitcast would be a sort of UKIP of Remain, perhaps in the Green Party, perhaps somewhere in the Lib Dems, saying, why aren't you? What's wrong with a youth mobility movement? The economy's not growing. Is this a free hit which you don't have to put a fiscal price tag to? Why aren't you going further on this? And obviously, there's more of those guys in Labour's actual voters. So that is and then you think about the Trump issue, which is if we are seen to lean towards Trump it's not a binary choice, but there are some choices to be made here. And if those choices go Trump rather than Europe, how's that going to go down with actual core of Labour's voters that gave them 170 majority?
And just to chip in on the subject of polls, because I just think this is a sort of not necessarily counterintuitive, but it gives you a sense of the dilemmas the Prime Minister and others really face. There was an Ipsos poll earlier this week on that question of leaning in a European or an American direction. And off the top of my head, I think the figure that leant in the direction of Europe was 49%, the highest figure since 2019, leaning towards America, about 20%. So you throw that into the mix with where Reform are in the opinion polls, and then the red lines that the government has set, and then where the Labour tribe is, as you were saying, Faisal, and you see the kind of tightrope down which the Prime Minister walks.
And just before we finish, we've been very nostalgic in this episode, but I think that's fine because I noticed Kemi Badenoch was quite nostalgic this week as well because she issued 5 tests for Keir Starmer's Brexit reset or EU reset. I just thought, that's very 2018 to issue 5 tests. What do you think about how she's handling it?
Well, she's trying to find a political space where she is less well-known than the Prime Minister, less well-known than Nigel Farage, trying to make her mark, picking the Conservatives up off the canvas after a horrific general election result for them, piecing the party back together and trying to find her voice, trying to not commit herself to too much policy that might not stand the test of time. So she set out these 5 these 5 tests, which it's back to Laura's point around the PEM and something on youth mobility, and those classic trade-offs that if you want that closer relationship, that's either going to mean accepting rules that you haven't had a say in the devising of, or potentially, and this is one of her 5 tests, handing over of money. And then that, in a more micro sense than we were used to 4 or 5 years ago, but reopens, relitigates all of those arguments about the trade-offs. But at the core of the Prime Minister's argument, of course, rewinding to that speech that we heard from the Chancellor a week ago in Oxfordshire, they are desperate to find levers that help with economic growth. And some of these things might contribute to that.
And a key difference right now is that I think they've got the business community now to say what they actually think. This is one of the dynamics that didn't fire during the first sort of Brexit era, was that a lot of business people were told, if we don't want to hear from you, just don't talk if you want to be in the room. And that's clear. They had to sign NDAs and things like that. Now they're being told, get out there, make your arguments. There's a press release today from the Institute of Directors, not exactly a bunch of lefties, backing the youth mobility plan. Like, big press release, we back a youth mobility plan. It's like, oh, okay. These don't come from nowhere, these sorts of things. So they're trying to sort of change the tenor of the conversation, but it's so sort of disaggregated, quite difficult. Like, as it was the eventual result of Brexit, it was a result of lots of atomised discussions and whoever managed to assert themselves. It's quite difficult to predict exactly where this goes from here, given the political economy, the polling, the parliament that we have.
Right. To be continued on Newscast every day, available on BBC Sounds. I'm just thinking back, something that always makes me chuckle about coming back from Brussels was, so in Brussels, when you have a beer, it comes like in a little half, and you feel all continental drinking them. And I remember thinking, oh...
Mine didn't the other night. Mine was a full pint.
Oh, well, they've changed since my day.
In Kitty O'Shea's, that great Belgian...
Love that. But I just remember thinking... I remember thinking when I came back to the UK, oh, I'll never drink those pints. They're so big and gauche and, like, unsophisticated. Turns out it's quite easy to go back to drinking. And also, Laura, the other thing that I learned so much from you in that era, because we would always talk once we finished recording an episode of Brexitcast, and you'd be very nice about it. You'd be like, it's all well and good, like learning this paragraph and reading that footnote. It's like, but you know, it is politics that kind of ultimately matters. And I'd be like, oh, we'll see. I was like, we'll see. And it's like, yeah, it's true. It is ultimately politics that kind of moves mountains. Like bits of paper don't necessarily do.
Objection, economics.
That's a whole other podcast right there.
Faisal, thank you so much for coming.
I'm getting thrown off.
Thanks for only being part of Brexitcast for about 10% of it. Laura, lovely to catch up with you too.
Oh, well, I'm getting booed off because I've got to go anyway, but it's been lovely being with you all.
Chris, thanks for the last, well, actually, it's 8 years now.
8 years. And we're, 2 podcasts down and 2 more to go tonight, is that right?
Exactly, because this is part of a big extravaganza we've been doing in the BBC Radio Theatre to mark 5 years of Newscast being available as a podcast every day. But we're very glad that you could join us for this episode. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.